Ukraine has just begun a very interesting campaign in the Belgorod region of Russia, which of course is a very strategic border region just to the north of Kharkiv, one of the most important fronts of this entire war. And in Belgorod, Ukraine has just started doing something they've never actually done before. And I realize I've been saying that a lot lately, because Ukraine has just been so innovative across the board, instituting new strategies that Russia just doesn't know how to respond to. Whether that is cutting off Crimea from fuel supplies, whether that is cutting off ships from entering the Sea of Azov, whether that is destroying wild berries warehouses all across Russia, Ukraine is finding new innovative targets left and right where Russia just doesn't know how to respond. And now we can add Belgorod to that growing list. Because in Belgorod right now, Ukraine is currently taking offline all of the gas stations. And in just the past 4 days of this campaign, the first 4 days of this campaign, Ukraine has taken offline a third of the gas stations in the entire region of Belgorod. Now, this is something different. It might seem familiar on the surface because Ukraine frequently strikes Russian energy infrastructure, whether that be oil refineries or loading terminals that actually load oil and natural gas onto the Shadow Fleet tankers. Ukraine has been doing that. But typically that has been done at the industrial level, stopping Russia from actually getting their revenues or from producing oil in the first place for their citizens. This is different though. This is a targeted set of strikes at a single particular region, not just trying to lower fuel supplies across all of Russia, but actually trying to stop an entire region from essentially functioning. In fact, as I watch what's happening in Belgorod right now, I can't help but to have some serious deja vu for what Ukraine recently did to Crimea, where they cut off the entire peninsula from fuel supplies, creating a fuel desert and causing Russian civilians to evacuate the peninsula in huge numbers, softening up the area in terms of civilian targets, so that if Ukraine ever does do future large-scale military actions there will be less civilians in the way. And I can't help but wonder if perhaps Ukraine is wanting to do something similar in Belgorod. And if they wanted to, this would certainly be the first step. Now, they can't cut off Belgorod in the same way as Crimea. Crimea has a couple of choke points that Ukraine has really exploited to keep things from coming onto the peninsula. But they can create the same overall outcome by taking offline all of the gas stations where people go to get their fuel. Sure, Belgorod could potentially recover, and there could be some kind of a civilian population that could figure things out somehow. But a lot of people, if Ukraine really continues to ramp up these strikes, will be inclined to leave. And it makes me wonder what Ukraine is actually planning. There's a couple of big options here. It could be that Ukraine is actually planning a counteroffensive, or rather an offensive, in the Belgorod region. And it wouldn't be the first time they've done this. They actually invaded Belgorod back in 2025, around the same time that they had their Kursk incursion. Or it could be that Ukraine is being very strategic, and they are softening up the border regions to make them less hospitable to Russian mobilized conscripts who might be arriving at the Kharkiv front soon. There is a lot going on in this region, and it's not just these gas station attacks. Something very interesting is happening in Belgorod, and it's actually time we start turning our attention here so that we're not just looking at Crimea and at Moscow, but we're turning ourselves to another theater of the war, which will probably become very active very soon. A lot to cover in today's video, right after a brief break for today's sponsor. In the modern digital world, it's unfortunately extremely easy to find your personal details. Just try Googling yourself, with your name, city, and state included. Often, that's all that's needed to pull up your private information in minutes or even seconds, including sensitive details like your home address. Just because it's listed, though, doesn't mean it's accurate, and yet this data can be relied on by many people, including potential employers, potential landlords, potential dates even, or even healthcare companies looking to raise your rates. Luckily, all of this can be addressed rather quickly by Incogni, the sponsor of today's video. Incogni helps address one of the main reasons our data is so available all over the internet, which is data brokers, who collect and sell your personal details for a profit. They make it easy to remove your data from hundreds of these data broker sites. Then, they help monitor those sites to ensure that your data doesn't come back. All you have to do is sign up, give Incogni permission to act on your behalf, and they get right to work, finding your information and demanding that it be deleted. The majority of websites can be caught by their automated removal service, but Incogni also offers Incogni Unlimited to take data privacy even further. This gives you unlimited access to submit links to specific sites to Incogni's privacy experts for removal, with most sites being eligible. I encourage you to try Incogni out for yourself. Just use the link in the description or scan the QR code on screen and use my code WARBURG to get a massive 60% discount off an annual plan. Incogni also offers a risk-free 30-day money-back guarantee. So try it out, give it a shot, and get a full refund if you're not 100% satisfied. So click or scan now, and now back to today's video. So as I mentioned, there is a lot going on in Belgorod right now. Taking out a third of the gas stations in just 4 days is no joke. In fact, we might call that a little bit of old-fashioned shock and awe. Ukraine is definitely trying to get Russia's attention here. But it's not just these gas stations, and far from it. In fact, there is so much happening in Belgorod right now that it would literally be impossible for me to fully update you, or even for me to be fully updated myself. And we can see that easily by just looking at the cumulative drone data. So for the month of June, there were approximately 7,500 drone attacks in the entire region of Belgorod. In the month of July, despite the fact that we have a week left as I'm recording, that number is already over 11,000. So Ukraine is really ramping up the strikes here, and they're hitting the traditional categories of targets, whether that be Russian armor, Russian vehicles, Russian infantry, Russian drone teams. But they're also hitting a lot of other unique kinds of targets that show us they're really trying something special here. For example, and this isn't confirmed, but it's mostly confirmed, Ukraine struck a dam in the Belgorod region just a couple of days ago that caused the dam to finally break. And as that water was flowing out of the dam, it damaged a very important road to the Belgorod region as far as infrastructure and logistics. So that's a big deal. Ukraine also in the month of July struck a thermal power plant in Belgorod. They also struck a fuel depot at the Belgorod airport. And we could keep going on and on down the list, but the point is, while Ukraine does these strikes all the time in certain areas, they're really concentrating their strikes in Belgorod right now. And it's actually very similar to what we see happening in Crimea. Now, we've been watching Ukraine long enough at this point to recognize a pattern. And we know that unlike the Russians, Ukraine's strategy isn't random. When Ukraine starts doing something like this, it's because they have a purpose. And usually when Ukraine starts ramping up strikes like this, we don't really ever see them let off. When Ukraine finds a category of target where they'll be successful, we know that they're going to hit that target over and over again. And so it seems like Ukraine is trying to do something specific in Belgorod. They are trying to soften up this target. And the question is, why might they actually be doing that? And why would they be doing that right now? It turns out that there are two major considerations that appear to be largely driving Ukraine's strategy right now. And both of these considerations are a response to the same event, which is upcoming Russian mobilization, which at this point is no longer just rumor, it's actually expected. It's expected that this fall or later this year, Russia will add about 500,000 men or more to their military to try to force an end to the war on terms that are favorable to them, and certainly to try to regain the initiative that they have now lost to Ukraine. Russia doesn't really have any big strategies, any big breakthroughs coming. All they really know is the meat wave tactic, and they've run out of meat. So soon they're going to add a lot more meat to the battlefield. And Ukraine is now trying to respond to that proactively before it actually happens. And these two major considerations, they're not really speculation. These are things that I have actually personally heard from the mouth of President Zelensky of Ukraine himself, who said, number one, Ukraine needs to prepare for Russian mobilization, and they need to really lessen the blow of that overall. But number two, Ukraine needs to actually go on the offensive more to take more territory back from the Russians. And that's probably a response to mobilization for two different reasons. First of all, if you take more territory back now while the Russians are weak, when they mobilize, they have to push through more to get to your major lines, and that's really important. But second of all, while Russia is weak, Ukraine can potentially right now throw the Russian military completely off balance so that even a mobilization can't save them. And I don't think a mobilization will save them, by the way. But of course, Ukraine has to do the best they can to actually prepare for that, which is why the mobilization won't save the Russians. And Belgorod is key to all of this. When it comes to Russia taking the initiative, a big potential target, probably one of the most likely targets, is Kharkiv, because this is a major Ukrainian city that is very close to the current front line. And in the past, when Russia has really tried to have propaganda victories, Kharkiv has been a big area of focus. When Donald Trump took office, this was a big area of focus. The Russians really wanted to impress Trump by taking Kharkiv from the Ukrainians. They had a big offensive here, but it failed. And part of that offensive is where we saw Ukraine's strategy of actually having their offensives into Russian territory in Kursk, but also in Belgorod, throwing the Russians off balance, making them deal with those incursions into their own territory so that they couldn't focus their resources on attacking Ukraine. All in all, that strategy worked before, and potentially we're seeing another more advanced variant of that strategy before our very eyes right now. For Ukraine, the more they can soften up Belgorod right now, the less effective any Russian offensive will be in the future. And in fact, the Russians will first have to focus on securing Belgorod before they can even think about attacking Kharkiv. And if Ukraine is actually effective enough, they could actually deny Russia of this strategy in the first place. If Ukraine has Belgorod on lockdown, especially from a logistics perspective, it won't really be possible for Russia to amass enough troops to actually even conduct an offensive against Kharkiv in the first place. Russia's already tried this and failed, remember. And so if Ukraine really gets control of the area, it could be that they actually disrupt a major part of Russia's strategy for mobilization in the first place. That is a genuine possibility, and I see several potential outcomes here that we could see in the next couple of months. It could be that Ukraine puts a lot of pressure on Belgorod in general to get the civilians to leave that area. That will free up Ukraine a lot with the military options that they can use to actually deal with the Russian military as it begins to amass there. And they can do that with a lot fewer civilian casualties. And that's really, really important. It could also be that Ukraine actually is planning to conduct an offensive into Belgorod to actually control that region for the short term. It's not a piece of territory that they're interested in holding forever. We have already seen that before. Ukraine was certainly willing to leave Russian territory when the pressures became too much, but it is a powerful bargaining chip for them for so many different reasons. If Ukraine holds Russian territory at the time that Russia is doing their massive mobilization, Ukraine will basically be able to dictate where the fight takes place, because that is bait that Vladimir Putin is almost certain to not be able to avoid, not be able to ignore. We've already seen that in the past. That will become the first target, and that helps Ukraine a lot to know the most likely areas that Russia is actually going to strike. So that's hugely important in and of itself. Now, I fully recognize that all of that might sound like a pipe dream, but at the same time, that's what I was told about Ukraine sieging Crimea when I started talking about that a couple of years ago. And now Ukraine has done exactly that to the letter, the way that we described that they ultimately would, and that's still ongoing today. Ukraine has a lot of cards up their sleeves, and they have a lot of things that they can use, and a lot of those are coming to the forefront right now, right at this critical time. Those being, most notably, of course, ground robotics. We've seen a couple crazy innovations from Ukraine's ground robotics lately, and it's really been in the form of delivery systems. We've already seen proofs of concepts where ground robotics can hold areas of the front line without any human intervention for a long period of time. Now Ukraine is actually deploying ground robots to the front on drones themselves. So the ground robots fly in on an aerial drone, they get deployed, and then they can hold territory. We also saw a case of a ground robot down in the Kinburn Spit being deployed by a naval drone doing an amphibious landing, something that typically would be considered very deadly, very difficult for humans to do, and it was done by a robot. These are all possibilities that Ukraine did not have a couple of years ago when they did their initial invasion of the Kursk region of Russia and the Belgorod region of Russia. And even at that time, Ukraine still used essentially this same strategy. So now what we're seeing at this point is this point where Ukraine actually has the initiative more than Russia does. Ukraine has way more tools than they did a couple of years ago, a lot more options. And they're now looking at a strategy very similar to what they were looking at a couple of years ago when they actually decided to move forward. So I would say, of course, it's not a guarantee, but it's a genuine possibility that Ukraine is planning something big and innovative in the Belgorod region to grab some of this territory, potentially a more significant piece than we might think, in some fashion before Russian mobilization can actually come in the fall. Now, whether or not that is in fact the case, the genius of all of this is that that does appear to be the case. And that's really worrisome for the Russians. Because as Russia is already worried about Crimea, as Russia is already worried about air defense and Ukraine striking so many targets across Russian territory, Ukraine is now gesturing here in another direction, which means that Russia can't just focus their resources on defending Crimea. They're recognizing that Ukraine is paying attention to the entire front and that Ukraine is opening up new opportunities for themselves everywhere. So it could be that Ukraine is gesturing at Belgorod, hoping that Russia will respond so they can strike somewhere else. It could be that Ukraine is gesturing at Belgorod because they genuinely believe that they can attack it, and they're trying to prepare the ground ahead of time. Whatever the case, Russia doesn't have a lot of good options to respond, and Ukraine is making use of the time now while they have it. Another really exciting thing, especially about these gas station strikes that Ukraine has now found so much success in, is that this doesn't have to stay limited to the Belgorod area of Russia. This is something that Ukraine has shown throughout the war. Whenever they find a successful target, they ramp up the strikes because when they realize that something is actually hurting the Russian war effort, they always want to do more of it. So if Ukraine is able to take offline a third of the gas stations in just 4 days, they can definitely expand that to other regions, other border regions. And really, as a whole, Ukraine has the ability to soften up a huge portion of the border regions before Russian mobilization ever happens. That is a big deal. And at the same time, I've already talked about this, but I just want to layer it into today's analysis. Ukraine is currently striking wild berries facilities all across Russia, which are critical for getting equipment to newly mobilized Russian soldiers, equipment like body armor, boots, uniforms, anything that the Russian military doesn't provide or what they provide is inadequate. All of that is going up in smoke. These facilities are burning everywhere. And so you're going to have a situation where Russia is mobilizing men without sufficient equipment, without the equipment that their current soldiers have at least been able to count on and rely on. And they're going to be entering regions where the infrastructure is more desolate and destroyed than what their current soldiers have experienced. And remember, their current soldiers with more training and more experience, in a lot of cases, especially more than a mobilized conscript, have not been successful. So Ukraine is really preparing and layering the ground no matter what, so that when Russian mobilization comes, they are as prepared as they can possibly be. And I am highly, highly confident for Ukraine. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in the next couple of months, as Ukraine does everything they can while they still have the initiative. So with that in mind, that's going to conclude today's video. We'll keep an eye on Belgorod. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel to be sure that you get